Hello and greetings from the unceded territories of the Lekwungen and Tsimshian-speaking peoples. My name is Christina Bonswin, and I am an Associate Professor of History and Indigenous Studies at the University of Victoria. In this segment of A Different Five Rings, I'm going to discuss an Indigenous-led boycott initiative of the 1988 Olympic Winter Games, which were held on Treaty 7 territories, the lands of the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina peoples, now known as Calgary, Alberta. Although a formal partnership was established between Treaty 7 First Nations and Olympic organizers, albeit late in the planning stages, tensions soon rose when the people of Lubicon Lake, a small Indigenous group of approximately 500 people in Treaty 8 territory in northern Alberta, began protesting these Olympic Winter Games. To briefly summarize, the historical struggles of the people of Lubicon Lake can be traced to the summers of 1899 and 1900, when treaty commissioners traveled to northern Alberta to negotiate treaty with Indigenous populations throughout the regions. Following the second round, treaty commissioners noted that several Indigenous groups had not been reached, and thus treaties had not been negotiated. The people of Lubicon Lake were among the missed groups. By the 1930s, they were actively seeking recognition under Treaty 8. By the 1950s, oil exploration had commenced in northern Alberta, and with the establishment of all-weather roads into these northern regions by the 1970s, Indigenous peoples were suffering drastically as a result of changing environments and lifestyles. By the mid-1980s, the people of Lubicon Lake were experiencing intolerable living conditions. Determined to bring the interests of their small community to national and international forums, they turned their attention to the Calgary Olympic Winter Games. Recognizing that a boycott of these games, like the boycotts of 1980 and 1984, was likely not feasible, the people of Lubicon Lake called for a boycott of specific Olympic cultural events, focusing squarely on an exhibit scheduled for the Glenbow Museum, which proposed to highlight and thus celebrate Indigenous cultural traditions. However, as the chief of the people of Lubicon Lake at the time appropriately reasoned, quote, "The irony of using a display of North American Indian artifacts to attract people to the Winter Olympics being organized by interests who are actively seeking to destroy Indian people seems painfully obvious," end quote. The people of Lubicon Lake drew attention to three troubling aspects. First, the $2.6 million budget for the exhibit included a $1.1 million donation from Shell Canada and a $300,000 contribution from the federal government, which, as they pointed out, was both ironic and hypocritical that these two entities would sponsor an Indigenous art display intended to celebrate Indigenous material culture, when in fact both were benefiting from the expropriation of Indigenous lands, including non-surrendered Lubicon lands. Second, they drew attention to the proposed title for the exhibit, "Forget Not My World, Exploring the Native Canadian Heritage." As they noted, the proposed title clearly implied that Indigenous peoples had disappeared from Canada's physical and cultural landscapes. Considering such criticism, curators quickly responded by rebranding and eventually renaming the exhibit to "The Spirit Sings, Artistic Traditions of Canada's First Peoples." Finally, the people of Lubicon Lake called attention to the highly problematic lending and borrowing policies of the Glenbow, as the museum proposed to borrow 665 objects that were essentially stolen from Indigenous peoples decades and centuries previously, with no procedural plans to facilitate a process of repatriation with these lending museums. In the end, the people of Lubicon Lake had achieved what they had set out to do. That was to bring national and international attention to a dire local matter. Although the Spirit Sings exhibit opened on January 14, 1988, it did so in the absence of artifacts from 23 lending museums who refused to loan artifacts to the Glenbow, and it opened in the presence of 200 protesters, including Matthew Kunkam, then chief of the Quebec Cree and later elected Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who, at the demonstration stated, quote, "I say if we share the flame, we should share the blame, and we must share the shame. It is a national shame for the Canadian people to allow the governments of Alberta and Canada to continue this bureaucratic warfare," end quote. The efforts of the people of Lubicon Lake had effectively garnered local, national, and international attention, ultimately forcing the federal government back to the treaty negotiating table. And while the government did not arrive at this time to negotiate in good faith, Lubicon's strategic targeting of the 1988 Olympic Winter Games had caught the attention of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which intervened formally in 1990. Although it would take 3 decades to eventually reach a land claim settlement, the strategic targeting of the Olympic Games by the people of Lubicon Lake played an important role in bringing local, national, and international attention to this dire matter.